Neel and I are going to kind of tag team a bit. I'm going to offer some introductory remarks to perhaps set some context for both the big picture and the project we're embarking upon. And then Neel is going to serve the meal. For several years after the so-called Great Recession, through 2013, it seemed that the generations-long rise in medical spending as a portion of GDP had been arrested. Healthcare costs rose for those several years at about the same rate as general inflation. The Obama administration credited the Affordable Care Act. Others pointed to job loss and health benefits loss due to deep recession and slow recovery, and to the deterrent effects of rapidly rising copayments and deductibles. Either way, fears that long-term medical spending trends were the physical equivalent of global warming seemed to dissipate. In 2013, U.S. health spending rose by 2.9%, the lowest increase ever recorded. But the next year, 2014, the most recent year for which figures are available, they typically come out. The journal Health Affairs publishes them in mid to late fall. So we're waiting for 2015. 2014, medical spending in the U.S. rose by 5.3% to about $9,500 a person, 4.5 percentage points above the overall rate of inflation in 2014, which was only 0.8%. Medical spending has probably hit the $10,000 per person mark by now. The Obama administration rightly pointed out that this one-time only coverage expansions under the Affordable Care Act were partially responsible for the 2014 jump. But Medicare spending, much less affected by the ACA, rose 5.5%, and private health insurance in the same year, 2014, rose 4.4%. So it seems soaring health spending is back. And prescription drug spending is leading the way, up by 12.2% in 2014. That's 11.4 percentage points above general inflation. We're getting breakthrough value from some of this spending. Hepatitis C is one big story here, but we're not getting breakthrough value from most of it. In a few moments, Neel is going to speak to the dismal value proposition that's offered by some of the priciest drugs for cancer. The central challenge for pharmaceuticals and other medical technologies is to selectively promote breakthrough value while discouraging minimal advances that blow up budgets. And no one's figured out how to do this. Once a new test or treatment comes online, one that yields even a small marginal benefit, we expect it to be provided and paid for. And you heard a fair amount about that today here. Loved ones expect it to be given to grandma in the ICU, or maybe even to the chair of the Department of Cardiac Surgery. The drug or device makers that develop the technology expect the same. Venture capital funders, private equity, and Wall Street demand it. And all these players press our political leaders and private and public insurers, and at times, the courts, to deliver on these demands. And woe to anyone who doesn't stick to this party line, think rationing boards and death panels and all the other available epithets. So we're caught between the psychological and therefore the political impossibility of saying no today and the prospect of physical disaster way down the line. Neel, John, and I are trying to chart an escape from this conundrum. What we have in mind is an evolutionary strategy anchored in people's different expectations about treatments that are technically feasible now and those that might arise as medicine advances. Put simply, most of us bristle at the prospect of being denied the benefits of today's healthcare on account of cost, but we're not made livid by our lack of access to the technology of the future. We hope for cures for diseases that terrify us, and some of us feel rage or despair over the blind cruelty of illnesses that wreck the lives of loved ones. But we don't rail against health plans, providers, and public officials because they don't deliver, say, if I may be silly about this, the magically effective care that Dr. McCoy gives his shipmates on Star Trek. This expectations gap offers a cost control opportunity that doesn't depend on widespread willingness to ration contemporary medicine's benefits and to incur the wrath of Sarah Palin. By reining in the development of ever more expensive technologies, we can restrain future growth without saying no now to beneficial care for identified patients. An obvious worry about this strategy is the risk of retarding advances that yield high value relative to cost and are thus worth paying for. But there's a fortuitous answer to this problem. Major breakthroughs tend to result from leaps in biological understanding of disease, advances in biochemistry and physiology that open the way for elegant and decisive interventions. One example, probably most of you learned about in high school, and that's penicillin, which destroys bacterial cell walls. It's cheap, and it was huge. A more recent illustration is the revolution in our understanding of lipid metabolism, which opened the way for the development of the statin drugs that tens of millions of Americans take to slow the growth of artery-clogging plaque. Therapies that target mechanisms of disease in such elegant fashion can be relatively cheap to provide once the basic science that supports them has been paid for. And by contrast, our most costly treatments, those that Lewis Thomas famously termed a long time ago halfway technologies, tend to rest on comparatively crude understandings of the biology of disease. They are paradoxically marvels of engineering, electronics, and material science, but of often modest therapeutic benefit. These treatments account for lots of the outpouring of medical spending that occurs in the last months of life, in surgical suites, intensive care units, and elsewhere. They're expensive because they're both technologically intensive and clinically indecisive. They employ costly, complex equipment and highly trained, well-paid personnel. And their inability, in most cases, to make more than a modest therapeutic difference leads perversely to their intensive and sustained rather than one-shot use. In medicine, as in warfare, decisive victory is cheaper than drawn-out struggle. A rational incentive scheme for therapeutic advance would reserve the greatest rewards for those technologies that are most likely to add clinical value. But the American healthcare system, as you heard today, and as you all know anyway, rewards the adoption of new technologies without regard or little regard for value. Physician time spent performing invasive technology-intensive procedures is much better compensated than his time spent talking to patients, consulting medical journals, going online, or ordering and overseeing minimally invasive measures. And so doctors have powerful incentives to adopt the newest halfway technologies. And in turn, biotech firms and investors have strong incentives to develop them and to push the political system to keep on paying. By contrast, clinical advances that build on biological breakthroughs to treat disease in decisive fashion typically yield fewer financial rewards for doctors, since these therapies tend to be less invasive and technology intensive. This reward scheme is a recipe for rapid growth of spending on those technologies that are least likely to yield high clinical benefits relative to cost. To the extent possible, the compensation gap, and other speakers have addressed this today, between physician time spent performing technology-intensive procedures and talking to patients or providing non-invasive care ought to be closed. This approach, you can do it by getting rid of fee-for-service, as Dr. Dean said, but you can also do it by equalizing fee-for-service rates. This approach can be applied more generally in ways that differentiate between technologies that are more and less likely to add high value relative to their costs. And here's something that no one's put on the table and that we are going to put on the table. Pharmaceutical and medical device firms could be rewarded for new products with intellectual property protection for varying periods based on how much a product improves therapeutic outcomes. And as Neel is going to underscore, the big data revolution makes this possible today in a way that it wasn't even 5 or 7 years ago. This could nudge research and development decisions over time toward larger therapeutic advances by reducing these firms' opportunities to reap windfalls from exclusive marketing of modest improvements. Alternatively, government could reward firms directly for medical innovation through prizes or other payments, while requiring all such innovations to pass into the public domain. Such rewards could be tied to favorable comparative efficacy research results or to sales levels, if and only if evidence-based clinical practice protocols come to play a large role in the adoption of medical innovations. Our core idea here is an evolutionary strategy, one that channels spending growth without awakening Americans' passionate objections to the withholding of beneficial care. This strategy seizes the opportunity that's presented by people's different expectations concerning access to beneficial care that's technically possible today and that might become feasible down the line. It exploits an opening for comparatively modest change in current law, and it anticipates industry actors' adaptations to changed incentives and to others' adaptations. It finesses a premise embedded in our culture and politics, the notion that doctors should provide care, whatever the cost, whenever expected benefits outweigh risks. I'll turn to Neel now to say more about our plan for proof of concept for value-based intellectual property protection in the field of GI malignancy.
Thanks, Gregg, and thank you, John, and for inviting me to come talk here. It's really a pleasure to be here. So, full disclosure, I'm an economist and a patent attorney, so I feel like a little bit of an interloper here. I'm, coming from a slightly different perspective, and clearly, most of you probably know a lot more about the issues related to the science of the medicine than I could ever hope to learn. But what I'm interested in is how we might reform the current system that we have, right? In particular, the patent system, to both lower costs and increase innovation. And what I'm working on with John and Gregg right now is trying to come up with proposals that are feasible and that could actually result in this sort of a change. So the first thing to kind of think about is, how are we doing right now? So I passed out just some charts, it might be on your table, that just show some basic results of metastatic colorectal cancer trial. So I should have put the sources here. I just put this together yesterday. But actually, we've been putting together this data for a while, but I put together the chart yesterday. And you can see that the results are from clinicaltrials.gov. So we looked at the results of phase 3 completed metastatic colorectal cancer trials with posted results, and looked at the difference in overall survival between the treatment and the control arms. And then we also looked online to find, at basic websites that aggregate drug prices across pharmacy chains, and so I tried to calculate what the average annual cost of care would be for each of these drugs. So, you might be able to quibble with what exactly the costs are and whether, the clinical trial, obviously these are different clinical trials with different inclusion criteria, et cetera. But the main point you should take away from this, if you look at the y-axis, which shows the difference in overall survival, it's in months, and, it goes up to about a little over 4 months. And if you look at the x-axis, which is the cost, you can see the cost of the drug relative to the control is almost up to, for the highest one's almost up to $250,000, and the range is, you're well into the tens of thousands for any of these treatments. So what's the point of this exercise? What's the point here? What I'm just trying to show is that we are spending a lot of money for drugs which are giving, on average, a modest gain. And this is not always true of all drugs. We talked a little about immunotherapy, and that revolution is still sort of to bear its full fruits, so that might be a game changer. But a lot of these drugs, we arguably are not getting what we're paying for. And we have to ask the question, well, why? Obviously, the science here is difficult. It's hard to find path-breaking new drugs, and industry presumably is trying pretty hard to do so. We've also got to ask, maybe our incentive structure, maybe our incentive scheme is not perfectly designed here. Maybe companies don't have exactly the right incentives to pursue maybe riskier drugs that could, if successful, be game changers. In other words, as Dr. Dean was talking about earlier, maybe there are incentives to produce drugs that are modest in effect because of maybe risk preferences of firms, right? So can we do better? So what our main idea here is that there's a push for value-based insurance and value-based sort of treatment options and stuff like this. why not try and take this same methodology and apply it to intellectual property, in particular the patent system? In other words, what we think we can do is take the reward that companies receive for coming up with a drug and tie it to the actual value as it emerges in the market. So what does that mean? So there's two sort of innovations right here. First is we'll talk about, I'll talk about this a little bit, idea of changing IP in response to value, right? That's not been done before. But before we even get to that, you have to have a methodological sort of revolution. And this relates to big data, right? And everyone talks about big data nowadays, but this is actually an area where there's a potential where it could really revolutionize the way we look at value. We have all this electronic medical record data right now that we're starting to get and we're starting to aggregate. And there are obviously issues. Dr. Dean again talked about how collecting this and aggregating it together is a challenge. But it's starting to happen, and what we can do with that is actually measure the impact of therapies as they emerge in the marketplace, as people are actually treated about it, right? And obviously, you can't just rely on observational data to draw the same result, to draw the same sort of inferences that you would from a clinical trial. But another thing you should draw from that chart that I showed you is that the number of clinical trials that are out there is surprisingly small. So you can't, there's a lot of missing gaps. There are not a lot of head-to-head trials between drugs that are state-of-the-art in any of these areas. So you might have to rely on observational data, on electronic medical records to try and fill the gaps. Now, obviously, a problem is if you use that kind of data, you have to worry that the people being treated for drug A are not the same kind of people who are treated for drug B, right? And so you have to do what's called risk adjustment to be able to sort of make sure you're comparing apples to apples. But as these data sets get richer and richer, and as we can use these data sets, take those results and benchmark them to clinical trials for which we already have results, we can develop models that give us a measure of value, right, that we could, in the past, not even imagine we could do, because this data was not even available. So our idea is to use these electronic medical records, come up with essentially a mathematical model that allows us to measure value based on all sorts of patient outcomes that are measured, right? And you can value those in different ways depending on what you want to say is more or less important. And we can benchmark those to clinical trial data for which we already have data to validate sort of our results. And then the idea is once we have a measure of value, again, this is flexible, however you want to measure value, that can go into this equation. Once you have that measure, you can use that to actually toggle patent protection up or down. And our theory is that if you make patents or IP dependent on the actual value that's delivered, you're going to end up incentivizing the pharmaceutical and the biotech industry to take perhaps more risks in order to try to sort of swing for the fences and go for the game changer. Because a lot of, my wife works in the drug industry, and I know a lot of people work in the drug industry, and they're concerned. They're concerned. They want to keep the lights on. They want to make sure that when they come up, it's a big risk to go through a clinical trial. And you want to make sure that you come up with something that's going to allow the company to continue to function. There's an inherent conservancy, right? There's a conservativeness there that's built into the system. And perhaps what we need to do is change incentives in such a way so that it pushes companies who are taking more risks, right? And you can design this, by the way, in a way that's not necessarily bad for the pharmaceutical industry. What we're proposing here is not necessarily going to be bad. You can design it in such a way that you reward extraordinary drugs, right? And you don't have to necessarily punish mediocre ones by giving them lesser patent term. That's a design choice that society is going to have to figure out what they want to do. Or you could design it in such a way that it's relatively neutral. There's some winners and there's some losers. But the point is that the value that the companies get for their innovation should be tied to the value that it produces for society, right? That's how most things in a market that works, people pay based on how much they value a good. In healthcare, because of the way, you have health insurance, you have this weird situation, people are at end of life, and obviously they want the very best care that's available at that time, so they're going to be willing to pay a huge amount of money at that, even if it's sometimes a modest improvement. We have to realize that there are these perversities in this market that are not in other markets, and so therefore we might need to adjust our incentive system to account for that, to try and make the value that companies deliver accord with the social value. And so that's the basic gist of our project right now. We're still sort of in the early stages, but we think that there's promise, and we think that this is an untapped policy lever, using the patent system as a way of both lowering cost and increasing innovation.
Thank you, Neel, very much. Thank you. Come join us. So you can see why I'm really honored to be working with these guys. One of our things that was very important to us within the Ruesch Center at Georgetown is not just to raise the issues and point light on the problem, but actually try and devise solutions to innovate and move forward. And these guys have described one of our projects around, as you heard, developing new patent law to incentivize innovation, to really target all of this investment and resource in a way that focuses companies and pipelines towards that broader innovation. But we have to, on the other side, deliver and recognize what the biology is telling us about cancers. Cancers are not the same. Not every pancreas cancer, not every colon cancer is the same. In fact, they are very different. And we are only now beginning to understand how to test, despite what the television ads say, how they are different and how molecular testing and profiling is distinguishing the different cancers. And so if you appreciate this from a market perspective, if all of a sudden I take a cancer like pancreas cancer with 35,000 new cases a year roughly, and then I say only a fraction of those are going to be eligible for a particular treatment, I've all of a sudden made a market that may be not of interest to a company to develop a product for. So that becomes even that much more expensive to identify what we call that enriched patient population, and they just don't want to go in the game at all. It's not a good return on the investment. So we need to also change our clinical infrastructure in a way that helps partner and identify those individual patients. It is how I would want to be treated as a patient. I would want you to take my tumor, I would want you to profile it using the current state of the art, and I would want to have access to whatever we think is the best medicine for whatever particular molecule, gene broken in that disease. Now, to do that, let me just do a model of a clinical problem. Let's say I have a drug that works on a target that is expressed in, say, 10%, and here I'm going to use a common cancer, 10% of colon cancers. All right, this is a fairly common cancer, but I've now whittled it down to only 1 in 10 will have the marker. And let's say I want to do a fairly simple, you've heard us say we want to do simple, smaller clinical trials. I only want 50 patients to go on this study, and I want to do the study in a reasonable time frame, 1 year. Because I've got burn time if I'm a company. I've got to do this as quickly as I can. In order to do that clinical trial, I've got to identify 500 patients, right? I've got to screen them all. They all have to be eligible. But out of that, I'm only going to keep the 50 that are going on to my clinical trial, and the 450 aren't eligible for that study. And so if I was a network, a system, I have to screen roughly 40 patients a month in order to identify those patients. You with me on the math? Well, there is no group in the United States, whether it's what we call cooperative groups or big cancer centers or networks, that has that kind of volume of patients in order to identify and enroll in a timely fashion. So our science tells us we need this, but we don't have systems built or collaborations built to do this. And so we at the Ruesch Center, and sponsored also by Georgetown and a group called CARIS, are in a series of partnerships on a national level and now on a global level to try and build such an infrastructure so that we have very high volume where everybody's cancer has been molecularly profiled, that walks in the door at all of these various centers, that a shared managed database has access to this. And again, it wouldn't be one partnered company, right? That wouldn't work because I don't want just the 50 patients and throw out the 450. We need multiple partnered companies who have a variety of agents to play together in the same space. And so we are working towards a couple of both national and global alliances to try and pull this together back to the public-private partnership. It's how I would want to be treated It's how I would like to treat all of my patients. And so these are examples, these projects are examples of work that we're trying to do to change some of what we're, to provide the infrastructure and to change some of the law that would enable moving forward at the pace that our public is expecting us to in the healthcare community. So any other comments, guys, on this? And then we'll open up for questions for the last few minutes of our meeting.
I just wanted to throw in a few, two quick follow-up, follow-up point and a question to John. Neel mentioned something towards the end of his talk that's really crucial to underscore, and that is that this model of value-based intellectual property protection does not have to be, and we're not envisioning it as, a takeaway from the pharmaceutical industry. One could develop this concept so as to essentially zero out the reward that the industry as a whole gets from the IP system down the line compared to how it's been. Zero out the aggregate reward, but make the reward greater in proportion to innovation, and yes, lesser in proportion to minimal clinical difference. I'm really curious about an aspect of John's remarks just now. Isn't it also the case, isn't there some good news to the specificity that you find that pancreatic cancer is molecularly many different things, to the point that one looks back and thinks, well, did it really make sense to use the term pancreatic cancer? Kind of like the ancient Greeks saying, earth, air, fire, and water is the elements. That's what they knew, right? But we're learning, you guys are learning more. But isn't the plus side that you find that some of the same molecular derangements are present in a whole bunch of other cancers that got different labels because they showed up in different parts of the body? And so you can cut across.
There's no question that there's that element where you identify key drivers, key markers that then are represented in other cancers. And maybe the same medicines would work, the same approaches would work there. But even more than that is the magnitude of benefit. What we failed to recognize is that when you treat a population that you really haven't accurately defined and you give everybody the same recipe, for example, well, we clearly know that with some cases we're helping, but in some we're probably hurting. There's a very good example of new cancer drugs that target what we call the EGFR receptor, and they're used commonly in colon cancer. And at the beginning, we didn't understand the biology, and so we gave them basically to everybody. We have now whittled down the biology to only about 20 to 40% of patients with colon cancer are now candidates based on a molecular test. And when we look, if we give the drug to the other 60%, we actually hurt them. It's tumor food. So we didn't know that at the beginning. So our overall deltas, many of the ones that you have reflected on this, are in unenriched patient populations. So we are removing harm. We're using the medicine in fewer people, yes, narrowing a market, yes, but the value to that individual patient has gone up enormously, and I'm removing harm, cost, side effects, and shortened survival from patients on the other side of that curve. So this enrichment is critical to developing medicines, seeing that magnitude of benefit and realizing that larger value. That's what I worry about why I'm engaged in this project is that we need to make it so that if a company risks an investment in a small subset of patients, that they in fact can reap the reward of that risk over the long term. But we can't afford that price to be what the market would have it to be right now. We need to keep it where we can afford it as a nation, but protect them for a longer period of time. My original comments about global outreach is that a lot of cancer care is not available around the world because of price, not just drugs, but CAT scanners and everything else. And so can we get to a price point where the company is still succeeding? We want them to succeed and doesn't break our individual national banks. Questions out there? Yeah, Neel, comment on that?
Yeah, no, I think that there are some really great points. Appreciate the question. First of all, I totally agree that our approach actually is, the Me Too drugs is kind of what we had in mind. A lot of, I mean, you think about it, there's a large amount of fixed costs in producing a drug. The value that the drug produces may not always be related to what those costs are. So a Me Too drug could cost a lot to actually get through the FDA approval process, but the value at the other end is maybe relatively minimal. And so what we want to do is make sure that firms are properly incentivized to maybe avoid those drugs, right? And to go for ones that maybe are going to have more of a positive social impact. And so I think our system of having a value-based IP would do that. The idea of when the patent is awarded, that's another great point. So there's this interplay between the FDA, approval process and patent approval, and they get approved at different times. And drug patentees can receive additional time back through something called the Hatch-Waxman Act, depending on the amount of time that the FDA took to approve the patent. We actually think that Hatch-Waxman might be an area in which we can actually put our toggle in, because already we're toggling patent term based on the length of the FDA approval process. One basic idea would be to maybe not award the full length of the Hatch-Waxman extension for drugs that have minimal improvement, or to award more for those that provide more social value. I've been thinking a lot about your third point, which is this idea that even when a drug is off patent, there may be only a limited number of manufacturers of the drug, and they have market power in the short run, because you can't get a competitor to come in and immediately start producing a drug, overnight, a new generic. So it is kind of a problem that overnight that these companies can essentially just jack up the price by 6 times or 10 times, or whatever Turing Pharma did, and that sort of didn't give them good press. So you kind of wonder why companies might want to do that. They can make a lot of money in the short run, but they might be sacrificing long run gain. But that's something which I've been thinking about, and you're right. There is the problem, or the issue is that there is still market power in the absence of patents, even when patents expire, because it's hard for new entrants to come in very quickly. So you're referring to something what we call general equilibrium effects in economics, and it essentially means like you've got to look. You throw a stone in the water, you see the ripple. You've got to see, okay, it bounces back. What are the other effects that sort of farther down the road? Certainly, if you change a law in a way that's not beneficial to the pharmaceutical industry, that's going to have an effect in the industry. So you have to measure that. That's a legitimate cost that you have to consider, right? So one way of avoiding that issue altogether is to design a law that is, as Gregg said, that sort of zeroes out. In other words, the companies in the aggregate are kind of in the same position as they were before the law. But instead of awarding everyone kind of this set patent term, what you can do is make that patent, if patent term means like the duration of patent protection. If just giving that as an example, if that's the lever in which you decide to to change based on the value that's provided, companies that provide more value might get more patent duration. Companies that provide less might get less. But you can toggle it in such a way that for the market as a whole, you're neutral. So the effects that you're talking about should be minimized in that sort of a situation. But yes, that's certainly a cost that should be taken into account when designing a system like this.
I just want to add, your question points to something critical, and Neel and I are at risk of perhaps glossing it over too much. When I said zero out, when Neel gave the spot-on answer that he just gave, yes, in the aggregate, this thing can be designed so that the industry as a whole is in a neutral position. But of course, in the real world, there can be huge transition costs. And much of our politics and many billable hours for lawyers are devoted to fights over transition costs. Look at the battle over coal as we realize that we have to move to other energy sources for environmental purposes. Look at any battle over healthcare financing. Even if new funds come in the form of taxpayer dollars, there's going to be winners and losers in the short term, and there's lots of fighting about that. Add to that the economic reality and the psychological reality of loss aversion, and that introduces perhaps a bias against a program, even if the reform, does result in zeroing out. Sometimes in healthcare, as, for instance, with the Medicare HMO program, this problem has been addressed by giving an industry an initial windfall, and that might be a route to go. But I think you're spot on in being concerned about these transition costs.
I wish we had lawyers that did third-party payer and co-pays. No, I'm just teasing. There's an example we've been living lately of a Ruesch product from called Xylota, capecitabine, oral 5-FU, went off patent, and a company called Teva has been making generic, but I think Ruesch had a factory somewhere, they were cranking out Xylota, so they actually cut the price under the Teva, the generic. So there's in this war of trade versus generic going on with that drug, and we're seeing it at the payer level because the payer is then negotiating with this manufacturer or that manufacturer for which product we're going to see. So the market is having some impact there too, just as an aside. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
We got good news for you.
So yeah, so maybe I wasn't clear about this. We definitely don't want to get rid of patents, and we don't want to eliminate patent protection. It's very key, obviously, for in the drug development industry and biotech. It's very important to have patent protection. All we're saying is that the value, think of it as, maybe for now, let's just think of it in terms of the duration of the patent protection, right? How long you get this exclusive right, this monopoly right to exclude others from doing what you're doing. That duration can depend on the actual value that's delivered by the product. So in your instance, the product that you're talking about, if your product is actually quite good, you'll actually fare better under the new system than you would under the old, because your monopoly right will extend for longer, right, if we're adjusting duration. So it's not, think of it this way, it's not against patents. It's essentially like, think of it as like pay for performance, right? Companies get their return based on actually the social good that they're delivering. Right now, there's a disconnect between what's being delivered and what the money that's there being received, and that's due to these complexities and sort of weirdness, honestly, of the healthcare market. What we're suggesting is that we can kind of correct for that by doing essentially, you can think of it as pay for performance, right? So if you have a really good product that's improving social welfare, that's creating value, you're going to receive more of a reward for it. That's pretty much.
And on the drug side, we're already starting to see pressure to incorporate a value metric for what a company can charge for their drug. So this is in a way to counter some of that, to ensure we continue to have investment, continue to have corporate interest in innovating in the cancer space. We need to make that a positive experience.
Here's a way to think about it. There's a disconnect between how healthcare works and how iPhone works. iPhones work. Apple just went big last week with the idea that they can get rid of the earphone jack, right? Maybe that's a train wreck, at least in the short term for them, or maybe longer, or maybe it's brilliant. The market's going to decide that, right? And we generally accept that the value of an iPhone, with or without a headphone jack, is determined by what the market says. But of course, in healthcare, things don't work that way, both because of the existence of insurance and what economists call moral hazard, and because of the lack of knowledge about patients and oftentimes even physicians. And so what we're trying to do is correct the value proposition here by linking the economic value of patent protection to the social value of the innovation in the same way that it's already linked for iPhones.
We certainly have been watching the pediatric oncology space jealously, if you will, over the last couple of decades, where they've made tremendous success. And it's a different world. One, almost every kid goes on a clinical trial. The culture of pediatric oncology is we're not going to accept the current standard of care, and whether you get an opinion on this side of town or that side of town, that kid with that disease will go on a clinical trial almost always. So parents will randomize their children before they would randomize themselves, in an interesting sort of different culture. Second, they're different cancers, and I realize that I can dodge behind that a bit, but pediatric cancers are fundamentally different in terms of their responsiveness to traditional chemotherapy approaches and the like. If you know your cancer history, it was kids with cancer that helped, where chemotherapies were first discovered and the like, and so many of those cancers were an optimization, treatments for those were an optimization of what we would think of as traditional chemotherapy, and they are, those cancers are more alike. You can bundle them better than you can colon cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer into similar buckets. We're not trying to devalue the incremental benefit. Colon cancer is a great example where we went from 1 drug to 11 drugs now. We went from a median survival of under a year to now 30-something months, right? And that comes not with any one major gain. It comes with lots of step gains. So we can't do away with that. But at the same time, we want people swinging for the fences. So it's more that we're trying to sweeten the pot on one end while we recognize the cost issue on the other. So that's where this idea comes from. But the reason we're discussing this at a forum such as this is to hear these kinds of comments, quite honestly, because as was said, this needs to be done in a collaborative. If it doesn't work for the industry, if it doesn't work for the payer, if it doesn't work for the individual patient, then it doesn't work. So it's not trying to shove something down the throat. It's trying to devise a system using our nation's laws and success to build it better.
And it's an iterative process. We hear this feedback, and it can enable us to adapt.
Just sort of first thoughts on this. I think that maybe adjusting the protection up or down, depending on the emerging understanding of its value, that might make sense. Because, for example, once you realize, okay, this is actually dangerous and the value goes down and maybe the patent duration that you're going to give is going to go down, what does that do? It creates maybe incentives for the company that owns the patent to try and actually say, no, actually, this is safe, and actually, this is really useful in these other areas. It gives them an incentive to say, no, you got this wrong, actually. One of the sort of secondary effects of the proposal that we have here is that some of the presumptions that we have in terms of patent duration, one of the proposals we're thinking is it's just a presumption in the sense that it's rebuttable. Yeah. So if the company actually comes up and says, you know what, there's no clinical trial that showed how good this drug is, but now we've actually come up with this clinical trial, and now you should adjust our patent protection back up. If that's convincing evidence, then it makes sense for the patent system to respond in such a way. So I could see how adjusting the patent duration up and down based on the emerging sort of value of the drug might actually create good incentives for industries to find new uses for existing drugs or put out new clinical trials to sort of show that their drugs are good.
Neel, Gregg, thank you very much.